Hello! We're going to go ahead and get started. We are missing Jeff from Big Campaigns. He's supposed to join us, but he'll be in here in a couple of minutes probably. We'll just wanted to go ahead and, well, get started because I'm really excited about this topic. It is a topic very close to my heart, as it's kind of one of the bigger concepts that I like to just think about. Today we do have Eternal GM again.
How's
And
everyone doing?
yeah, and Blaze Reason of Ishinekhan is also here, but he's like always here
As
because like
always. Hi,
yeah,
everybody.
and obviously it's me, just Kyle. It's fine.
Just Kai.
Yeah, it's
He's
just
only
Kyle.
beloved by the tabletop RPG designer community.
Yeah, right. Like whatever. No. What? I'm a loser. It's fine. No. No
Hey!
self-deprecation. I'm sorry. That is literally my go-to joke. What am I thinking? Oh, right. I actually have a list of things that I want to kind of talk about. So the first bit, the first kind of like focus of this chat will actually be, I've named it the Dungeons Without Dragons, because we're talking about dungeons. And I kind of wanted to first talk about dungeons across all of nerdery, right? So not only just tabletop role-playing games, but also video games, stories, movies, comics. It's fine. It's okay. That's kind of what I want to talk about, and kind of get a good feeling of what and how dungeons are used. So my first kind of question to the group is, do you have a favorite dungeon? And it could be from any nerdery concept that you would like to kind of throw in as kind of like a great example of what a dungeon could be?
That's a good question. I think I'll have to think about it a bit.
That's
You
completely
got
fine.
anything now, Eternal?
I want to come up with my favorite one, but I'm gonna throw out one of the most noted ones in video game history. The Water Temple. Don't overcomplicate them.
Right. So I wanted to kind of go into that later about bad dungeons, but
Yeah, no, we can leave that till later. But like, yeah, there's an example because I'm like, no, the moment one of us throws one, it's gonna help us start narrowing them down. Because I'm like,
right.
favorite.
Yeah, it's really tough. I think so for myself. I think one of my favorite dungeons would actually have to be um see, I should have probably even thought about my answer to this before I even asked it myself, but well.
Oh, Jeff is here.
Jeff is here. Cool. We can
Hi,
bombard him with the
Jeff.
question. As soon as he pops into view, we'll like first let's make sure that we can hear him and everything. Well, like,
Good morning, everyone.
hey,
Yes,
it's
we can hear
you.
You're
him.
doing.
Huzzah!
Huzzah! You can hear us, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Good.
Awesome. So I'm bombarding you with a question, and the question of what we were talking about at this exact moment is, do you have, and what is it, for a favorite dungeon in all of nerdery? Like, best example of what a dungeon could be. I don't want to really talk about like the worst case, which has already been brought up right now, or worst cases, but just kind of like, do you have a favorite one?
If I think of all dungeons everywhere, all at once,
Yes.
um,
I feel like
I
that's like
would,
a book title right there. Let's save that for a book title.
I'd say probably one of my favorite dungeons that I've gotten to be a player in was ran by a buddy of mine, Doug, and every room he had mapped out which of the 4 doors take you to a different spot in the dungeon.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like an 8x8 room with 4 doors on each wall. and you open the door to go through, and you pop into one of different squares or a different part of the dungeon. And so if you as you kind of kept playing, you kind of got the hang of it naturally, which made for a very rewarding experience, but also a very fun one because I was playing a character. We were playing 4th edition, I believe, at the time, and my character was a battle mind, and I think I'd gotten up to on an average turn, I could hit about 30 squares of movement, which let me run through multiple doors and doors and doors, and run through this crazy dimensional dungeon, which is a lot of fun. So
Yeah, that sounds actually really rad. So I actually think I knew what my favorite dungeon is now that I've had time to actually process of Ghosts. I wrote down this question like days ago, and I didn't even think about my answer. But thinking about it now, I think my favorite dungeon concept from all of my experience in all of the things, like not just tabletop, but obviously video games and stuff, would have to be Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past, very first dungeon, the Hyrule Castle, where you are kind of you start the game, you kind of like the narrative is that it's a rainy night, your uncle decides to leave to go protect and stuff, and then you get worried and go after him, find a way to sneak into the castle, and you find him dying. You take a sword and you go and try and save Princess Zelda. But that sort of introductory dungeon of like the first thing it teaches you right off the bat is to look around, right? Which is a common trope in that game of just like there are hidden secrets, and some of these hidden secrets are used for you to be able to progress the story, because if you don't, then things are going to get much harder or you're going to be soft locked until you find it. But then it kind of also introduces just like one of the more common enemies, the guards that you'll have to constantly fight, and like goes into actually dealing with your first boss, which teaches you that you should use whatever main item you find in a dungeon to tackle the boss normally. That is the best way to fight those bosses in that game. And I think that's a really good introductory dungeon to kind of like how to be a player in a dungeon. Setting up these goals so that you can kind of like learn this is what is expected out of you when you're going through with them.
Yeah. And now that I was thinking about what's my favorite dungeon, my one question that came up is, what exactly is the dungeon and what doesn't count as a dungeon? Because I had the idea of the Mass Effect 2, the final, the suicide mission, where you attack the collector's base. I think that would be my favorite, but I'm not sure if that counts as a dungeon, because I guess technically it's relatively linear, and you cannot go back once you're deeper inside.
Yeah, for sure.
I feel like that. I feel like that counts because majority of dungeons, no matter how creatively made, are linear. Like the dungeon part, I think is something we all accept as fun railroading, right?
Right. So like I love that question because that is something that I kind of wanted to talk about for sure. But I also am kind of like of the mindset that anything can be a dungeon as long as you're approaching certain bits and concepts with it. Like it is, as Jeff said, like fun railroading, because I mean, kind of it is in the way that you're limiting players to an area or actions, but it's kind of also narratively designed so that it doesn't feel like you're forcing them in that sort of situation most of the time. Actually, it does that because of that question. Another one of my favorites and this is actually from a movie, and it's a recent movie. But I like to, when I was thinking about this movie after watching it, I kind of thought about it as like a dungeon experience because, in some experience, it was, and that was Bullet Train. Because that entire movie, I mean, it's a mind fuck if you're trying to pay attention to all of the story. But if you think about it in like a tabletop sense, the all of the players are forced in one location, and they're all dealing with each other, but they're also not. And it's just a really good. I don't want to say too much without like actually spoiling anything because, like I said, it's kind of a mind fuckery movie of trying to pay attention to all of the plot lines. Um, but I consider that a dungeon, and I think that's a really interesting dungeon design space. So, yeah, Mass Effect 2, that is perfect dungeon right there.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess with the Mass Effect suicide mission, it's less about the dungeon itself, but what it builds up to, right? All the decisions in the game put together, flow together in that final mission. Did you make the right decisions to keep your allies alive? And then the music is so freaking epic. I love the Mass Effect trilogy.
Right.
And that's one of the best missions, if not the. No, it is the best mission in all in the whole trilogy.
Wow. I can't argue, but like, wow. So brave.
I mean, come on. I'm not saying that like there are many great other missions in the Mass Effect trilogy, but we're talking about the suicide mission final here.
Right, like there's a lot of build up to it essentially. Like I get because of that, like in narrative sense, that mission has a lot of weight just because there was build up to it. If there wasn't build up to it, it would not have had as much of an effect. But like, yeah.
I agree with that. If it were just
go for it.
If it were just a side mission, I mean, it would still be decent. I mean, you do have an epic boss battle at the end, but
really weird side mission. But yeah, can you imagine a game where the side mission is to go kill yourself? That sounds horrible. To go suicide? Nope, that's still bad. But still,
that's been done. That has been done. Borderlands 2, Handsome Jack pays you money to suicide.
You are correct that it is a side mission of where you have to go off yourself.
Yeah, off a fucking high cliff. It's like, I just want you to remember, you sold out.
But hey, the suicide mission, the goal is not to die. The goal is to take out the collectors. It's just that it's insanely difficult, and that's why they call it a suicide mission.
Right.
It's not the goal.
I really liked how that
kind of
I really liked how that dungeon was created, and I really liked how they built the game up where you assign people kind of makes a difference.
Right.
I felt the really amazing payoff was in Mass Effect 3 or you kind of get at the end of 2, but like you really feel at the 3 when if it loads up your old information, those characters died, the ones you chose wrong. Right? Where you get that full complete feeling of like, oh, okay, maybe I messed that up or maybe I did as best as I could. But it was a wonderful dungeon with a wonderful premise.
Yeah. I agree. I think that was a really good call. So, to continue with the motion, Eternal, do you have a dungeon now in your head you want to share?
Yeah, everyone going with something newer kind of made me dig a little deeper, like more towards kind of stuff from my youth. So
would you consider Link to the Past newer? Because that's kind of old too.
I mean, I think anything that is before the 90s would be newer, and older is like early 90s and prior. Because I'm going to like the 80s. I would have to say my favorite Labyrinth, the thing that's affected and influenced the random characters and scenery and styles of doing it would be the movie Labyrinth. That whole movie is a dungeon.
Hmm.
And if
You
you
with
think
your
about it,
movies that all are dungeons, right? that
Right.
all take place in one dungeon.
well, yeah,
I'm,
look, you do
I mean,
Dungeon of a Mad Mage or you do Labyrinth. One's done right, one's just meant to fill out a book.
yeah. Actually, labyrinths is also kind of something that I want to talk about later because the conceptually labyrinths are even weirder than just a normal dungeon. But like, yeah, labyrinth, right? Movie. Sorry, I just side thought.
It's fun. No, that's just been the most influential dungeon in media or tabletop in my experience. If I had to put one from tabletop specifically, it would have been the Tomb of Horrors because it was the first attempt at making a dungeon not for the characters, but to mess with the players. And so, like, it was unique in that fashion. But I'm pretty sure a lot of people have redone that kind of vibe to dungeon design since.
Right.
But it was a pioneer in it. So it holds a lot of high respect due to being the first in that kind of area.
Yeah.
But Labyrinth is my favorite one. Like, I have songs in my head associated with that dungeon.
Right. Um. I mean, if we want to go older, we can talk about the quote unquote missions of from the Star Wars movies, specifically like the original ones, or even like just the planets, because the planets themselves in the movies were kind of in concept dungeons, right? And
Mm.
that's kind of like my whole thing is like as long as they are set in stone locations, that's normally a good way of for me to dictate if it's a dungeon or not. Set in stone locations that have like some unifying concept that kind of is there to help a character grow in some way, be it a player or an actual character in a story. Um, or to just test metal, I guess, because that's also a good case, as in the final mission is not just a character, because that wasn't about growing as much as just how far have you gotten, how far have you thought ahead, etc. For that suicide mission. Um, so, but to kind of bring it back to another bit that we kind of already touched on is bad dungeons, like, and of course, what makes them bad. It's already been stated. The Ocarina of Time water temple, water dungeon, has always been kind of that thorn in the side of a lot of Zelda fans and players because, well, it was kind of badly. There was a bad layout, right? Because it was playing on 3D space, which it was still new to the developers, and I'm kind of defending them, and I really shouldn't because I mean, well, it was just bad, right? Um, but like
I,
we are aware why it was bad, right?
Yeah.
So
I mean, the fact that made it so bad literally is just the way they utilize the water. They did that so bad to this day. If we build a dungeon and there's water in it and a lever anywhere, the players want to quit.
mm,
Like it affected things that bad. I had this really
collective
cool
trauma.
ancient temple that was a four-layered actual puzzle
mhm,
that as you shifted things in it, it would shift and rotate and make shifts in the whole thing. So it's a puzzle dungeon.
mhm,
The fact that water was involved in moving around the hydraulics of it really made just people want to quit. It had nothing to do with exploring.
right,
And like it affected things that bad. So when design on them and things like that, like the water temple, I would say you can design bad, but don't design it so bad that you literally cause it to never be utilized again.
mhm,
I feel that should at least be the goal when talking about bad design. That's as bad as you can get. You ruin that option for other people.
yeah. And I mean, I won't. Again, my players and stuff like that. I can't say all of them would be against a water dungeon, but it is one of those things that they become harder to sell because of that experience, right? And I think that, like what you were saying, I think that does kind of like if it becomes harder to sell that concept, then I mean that was a bad experience, and of course people don't want to go through it again. But like, is there any other bad kind of dungeons or maybe even a situation where it just didn't feel needed, right? Like there was just essentially a dungeon and it's just like, I mean, this is weird, but was it actually needed to be a dungeon or could it have been something else, right? Like could they could they have gotten it through an email? No. Uh,
Um, on that, Dungeon of a Mad Mage and most first-person shooter little dungeon-like areas.
right.
You don't see a lot of creativity generally. You just see things that look like it would be in that area.
Hmm.
But like the big flaw I'd always point out is you never see anything that's realistic. Like in a wizard's tower, there's never a bedroom.
Right.
Like there's just
Uh,
small, simple little things that I would say are part of bad design because it destroys the immersion. Like, oh, this is another room. But if you walk in a room and you can tell its purpose by its description, it feels more real.
yeah.
And a lot of first person shooter things like Borderlands is horrible about it. It's literally just 500 fucking extra rooms in this warehouse. Like, why? We could have had 12
Hmm.
and they all could have been different.
Right.
It reminds me of Elder Scrolls Oblivion, right? Where the most of the dungeons kind of look copy pasted, just a few correct doors or the same room over and over again.
So I will say, and maybe this is because I am someone who actually does like the concept of labyrinths or mega dungeons. I don't need necessarily a reason for every room if that is the thing that is selling the concept of them. But of course, I can kind of get into that when we start talking about like different types of dungeons. Um, because like I do agree that when you're building a dungeon, especially if it's like something closer to a realistic dungeon, a smaller dungeon, floor of a place, or whatever, you should kind of think about obviously what should exist there. Because when you don't, yeah, you get really awkward things. I mean, and I kind of want to point out, like, because Blaze did bring up like Elder Scrolls, they barely put a lot of thought because like there's no places with any form of bathroom, and I'm not, of course, just saying bathroom because yeah, it is in a time where like toilets wouldn't necessarily exist, but I mean, you also don't have the bedpans in a lot of those games, right? Which
In
you would. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, you said Elder Scrolls, but in Skyrim, you can actually find often bucket rooms where the
Yeah.
implication is quite clear once you start thinking about it.
Um.
But um,
I think my point mine mainly came to, besides like the realism of the area, it's like when looking at a mega dungeon,
Mhm.
why was it built? I
Mhm.
think that's a part that a lot of people are like, I want to make a really cool dungeon and I want to make it massive, but they don't go, why and how would someone have constructed this massive thing? And
Well.
I feel like, okay, think about this. That answer is all the flavor to Dungeon of a Mad Mage.
Mhm.
And if they would have applied it a little less like, Jesus, just floor after floor after floor, and each one is just this whole different setting,
Mhm.
maybe it would have come off a little better. But it just felt like it would have been better as an area or hex crawl kind of setup instead of a downwards going dungeon.
Right.
But there was reasons for it. They explain it with the history of the Mad Mage and all that. A lot of massive, huge dungeons don't have that. They're
Yeah.
just really huge.
Yeah.
I've wrote that he'll be back soon, so
Okay.
yeah.
Well, I mean, is there any other negative dungeons that we can talk about? I think
Diablo ones.
I'm. I mean,
Okay, yeah.
you could. They are kind of bad in like a normal, like especially in a narrative sense of a dungeon. I would argue that they could be good in like the game design challenge because I mean obviously there are people who enjoy those, but I do agree that from like a narrative perspective, they also do kind of feel really flat. So then
See,
again,
video games
Yeah,
it's easy to do
general. Sorry,
that.
internal.
In video games, it's easy to do that because there's a lot of flashy visuals. But tabletop, I feel it really lends a
right?
hand to give it backstory,
Hmm.
reason, meaning, and a little bit of, hey, this is where Home Dude sleeps.
Right.
This is where he stores his supplies.
I do like when even in a video game or whatever when we're talking about a dungeon when you actually give nod to some of those extra things even in a video
Mhm.
game just because I mean that is just really nice for me because it kind of like we thought about that um actually thinking about bad dungeons I think one of the things that I personally didn't like in some of the uh well, I'm just gonna say, in some of the Pokemon games, I would consider the gyms kind of like their dungeons themselves, right? Some of them are just kind of really bland when you compare it to all the other ones. But I think that's just because they was designed in a very awkward space of both trying to have an interesting puzzle that you can solve with very minimal capabilities, um, while also like still being interesting enough to be a place to go as your character and do your challenge there. Specifically, one of my least favorite dungeons would probably be Lieutenant Surge's Find the Button because
Oh
I
yes, that
hate
one.
that concept. When you have like so many options and it's literally just you gotta press every single thing and it's I don't know.
And now,
I don't.
yes. And if you know the trick, you have the 50% chance that you don't have to look at everything all over again, right?
Right. Mm.
Yeah, though. And I mean, you have to look through trash cans. It's like even thematic. It's like,
I mean,
why?
I mean
Maybe it was
that
a
game.
metaphorical description of you weeding your way through the trash to make your way there. No.
Um.
Uh,
Yeah. I think the Lieutenant Surge's battle was fine. It was just the challenge was not necessarily something that I think was interesting given the concept. But
yeah. You're making me all nostalgic. Pokemon is for me the most nostalgic game of all time because the very first game I ever owned was Pokemon Blue Edition.
no, there you go. I mean, Pokemon is a great case study for when it comes to different types of dungeons because you have the challenge dungeons in the gym battles where it's literally about can you go and do the thing with your team, or you have the exploration dungeons in the sense of
Mhm.
caves, or Team Rocket bases. Um,
The gym dungeons also have the excellent excuse for they're specifically built to challenge trainers, right? So you can
mhm.
go as illogical as you want. So,
And of course, in the later ones, you also do get some side extra dungeon concepts, but I mean, that's dependent on which one you're specifically talking about. Um,
Mhm.
but yeah, no, I just think like, of course if you have to come up with say 8 dungeons every game, a la Pokemon, I could see where, eventually you'll start to missing on some of those dungeon concepts because it does get harder, especially when you have limited tools to work with what the players can do in a video game sense or not. Of course, the fact that Lieutenant Surge's thing was, in the first game, yeah. Um, but no, I, yeah, I forgot what my words were. I think that it's
Yeah.
interesting, especially when you start like breaking down, what are you considering dungeons in any sort of format, and just kind of like use them as use cases of like what can we learn from them. And I mean, I do that with a lot of stuff, anyways. Like with Pokemon games, I mean, games in general is really useful for bringing some of those concepts into the like tabletop considerations. But you can also do that with movies and books and stuff as well when they have interesting like how did they use those?
Hmm.
Because like sometimes you'll get some really interesting like hidden potential applications that you wouldn't think about. Um, so is there any other dungeons we want to bring up before we go into the next
Um,
question?
on a positive note, not a specific one,
Okay.
but the games of Castlevania and Metroid are
Right.
effectively really huge dungeons that focus on the concept of making you return to areas,
Yep.
which I think
Metroidvanias
the
are
cool
delicious.
different thing they did with dungeons, and it's why Metroidvania is a genre now.
Metroidvania
I
is
also want.
delicious.
I also wanted to mention the Metroid Prime trilogy in specific. One of my favorite game trilogies.
Hold up, that is the best Metroid ever.
Well, there we go. That is a
Yeah.
claim. I have no opinion about the claim because I like Metroidvanias, like Metroid and whatnot. I just not played many of them, ironically enough. Um, I should
I
I
mostly
should
just
correct that.
played Metroid games.
Yeah.
Like, of course, I played the trilogy. I played Other M. I played Dread, of course, the newest one. And wait, that can't be all. I'm pretty sure that I played at least one. So that's all? Huh. I would have thought I would have played more. Huh. Maybe like
I
Metroid Prime, my love just is so inflated that I didn't notice that I didn't play much beside that.
I
Uh,
have not played any Metroid actually.
oh yeah, of course, the Metroid for the DS. How was it called again? It wasn't that good, to be honest, except for the multiplayer. That was fun, but I
I
forgot it.
mean,
But
I'll
yeah,
tell you, they're not something you have to play.
Yeah.
If
No.
like Metroidvania style games aren't it,
Yeah.
look, I can't
No.
do it. Not that long term. I just watched my friend play through one where it's some weird religious thing in this dream world, and basically he's got to take up all the despair into him and end his life. So he takes the despair and leaves hope. And it was just this really cool long game, and then it's just like, hey dude, you're playing this like 4 or 5 hours every day for the past month. And he's like, oh yeah, I just got to keep trekking over the entire dungeon. How big is it? It's like a room like this small was bigger than the screen of your computer by 4 or 5 directions either way.
Right.
This was massive. And one new item, you had to go everywhere.
Yeah.
And there was dozens. And I'm like, no, I can't do that.
Yeah. They are
Like,
time sinks. I mean, one of my only Metroidvanias specifically that I played would probably be I believe it's called Ghost. That's on Steam. And I mean, you play as like an AI and you're trying to do some stuff. And it's a really interesting game. I really enjoyed it because the themes and stuff is kind of fun and whatnot. And like it just has some good game design in general. So maybe I should look
maybe you can
into it
go
or
in
something.
more specific, right? What makes Metrovanias, or at least good Metrovanias, so good dungeons, and what can we learn from them, right?
Oh, for
I
sure,
think
yeah.
what Metroid Prime does excellently is atmosphere. Of course, it's not that easy to copy that into a tabletop RPG, but I think the music does a lot. I love the soundtrack. Actually, my ringtone is a soundtrack for Metroid Prime 3. And I was also sorry for 2 echoes, yeah, from 2. Right. And
Honestly, when you lifted up your phone, yeah, it looked like you had a yellow thing, and my brain first thought of like that special yellow Game Boy, like Pikachu yellow Game Boy, and I was like, that's not a phone, that's a Game Boy. But then I was like, hold up, you only seen it for a split second.
See, I don't know if that's worse than mine because when he pulled it up, it was further away from the camera, so it looked
Right.
like those old small plug-in little MP3 things that you just had to left or right or play.
There you go.
And
Yeah.
I'm like, wow, because it's like that yellow.
I like yellow. Yellow is my favorite color, all right? My Switch
No,
is also yellow.
there's nothing bad about it. We are not calling you. Oh my God, you do like no. There is nothing bad about liking yellow. It's weird. No, I'm kidding.
Hey, I'm weird, all right?
You like Pikachu? No.
That yellow rat.
I mean, everybody likes Pikachu to a certain extent, right? But
No.
my favorite Pokemon is Kyogre, or however you wish to pronounce him.
You can see Mew poking out of the Mario backpack.
Yeah. Mine is all the owls. I'm a bird trainer in Pokemon. Obviously, you can tell because I like birds. Specifically, I like the well, I mean, my original favorite was like Hoot Hoot, but then Darstrix was just great and was even my Facebook profile picture for like years. But that's neither here nor there. When it comes to Metroidvanias, I think the number one thing is ironically that whole going back, which I mean, Eternal kind of brought up as like a bad thing, but if done right, is kind of a good thing, especially for GM prep and dungeon sense, because like if you can reuse the assets, the areas and stuff, it's really nice. The issue is trying to find a good way in tabletop to make it to where it doesn't feel awkward or slow down the narrative to go back. Um, because I mean, sometimes people like, okay, we'll go back, and the easy answer is just to teleport them back. But that's not necessarily an interesting story. But in a video game, that's essentially what they do, right? Like you or would want to do is teleport back to the location that you might have seen that had that one thing.
Or like Borderlands does it where when you get to the end of one of their dungeons, the last part of that dungeon is always put you right back at the opening.
Right.
Like when you're done, you don't have to go back through it. And that's the big thing is in a TTRPG, you could go back through it if you want. And you could roleplay that out with your GM, right? Your GM could talk about things that have changed. You might be able to learn something. It might be neat. But in a video game, I would absolutely hate to try to go back out of, I don't know, the wooded forests in Ocarina of Time.
Right? Yep.
When you have to be like, okay, left, right, left, right, straight, left.
Yeah, the Lost Woods. Yeah.
Yeah, if you had to leave and also follow the pattern, it'd be like, cool, I don't really like this game.
Right.
Like,
yeah, having some way of ease of leaving for when it's useful is obviously super useful because they should want to. You want to be able to allow your players to not experience the slug that they've already been through, especially if there's like really awkward mechanics that especially breaks if you go in the opposite direction, right? I mean, I'm just going to throw Pokemon under the bus again. This is not bad game design. This is just consideration. But imagine if you had to uh, the like places where they have like the ice slide stuff, of course, they thought about how you would go back on those some of the times to be able to reverse your stuff. But imagine where you only planned out how to use that to get to point A from the starting point, and then the players wanted to go back, and now you're in an awkward situation. Well, if they followed the exact same thing, it might not work because these stopping points was designed only for, you know, the one direction. Of course, that gets fixed in, like, specifically in Pokemon. They don't do it bad because they do it to where, if you do have to go back, it's easier. Especially if you got to one of their choke points, it's literally just a straight line, or straight line enough, I guess. Most of the time, I don't think there was any bad cases for that, but I know that that has one of the most potentially bad areas. If you have to run things backwards, because not every time you'll think about needing to run things backwards. And that's not a bad thing to not want to have to consider, if you're not planning on them to go backwards in that sense. But it is just something to think about, I guess. And that was enough of me rambling on that. uh, I just realized that the title of this is not right.
I mean, I guess I'd kind of say in the same way, like a heist movie, part of the heist film is the escape, right? Like you should get to the MacGuffin, and then part of that fun is the escape and them either selling it or the fencing and whatnot. I feel like for a dungeon to be good, there has to be that moment where when you beat the dungeon, you're no longer bound by it, right? Dungeons have to capture you for a certain amount of time until you're ready to move on or go somewhere else. But then once you get done, whether it's Borderlands where, oh no, I left all my dynamite against that wall, but now that you're here, maybe you could set it off. And you're like, okay, well, cool, I'll leave.
Oh no.
Or think like Dark City, if you ever saw that movie, which is basically I live in a dungeon until I realize that I can control the dungeon, kind of thing. Or heck, I mean, or Running Man, that old Arnold Schwarzenegger movie from the 80s. Literally, that's a dungeon until he gets to the point where he realizes he can escape the show and attack the building instead, right? He can fight the bad guy. But he has to be forced through a dungeon first. So I think the dungeon concept, and maybe that's what made the water dungeon suck so much, was when you got done with it, you weren't done. It like it never ended. It kept going, and you're like,
yeah, because once you like learned the big thing, like you still had to apply that in a very awkward manner to actually use it, and it just got to a point where it was easier. Huh?
And over and over on different levels, and if you forgot one thing, reverse 3 steps to hit a switch. And it's just like, oh my god, you wanted people to quit your game, didn't you? No.
The funny thing is, I actually played Majora's Mask before I played Ocarina of Time, and like the dungeon I have the most negative emotions towards, I think would be actually the water temple in Majora's Mask, because at least as a child, I found it rather complicated with the different levels and adjusting the streaming. And as a child, I was terrified of the end boss. Like, I can feel the childhood fear from that water monstrosity.
Yeah,
I don't know why, but
I was a weird kid. I did not fear that one. But I did play more Majora's Mask than Ocarina of Time because I owned Majora's Mask. I did not own Ocarina of Time. But I did play it because my friend had it and I was able to borrow the game, which is something I miss. Being able to borrow games. It just becomes harder and harder in the PC age that we're in. But yeah, the Water Temple of Majora's Mask I actually feel like was a little bit better, but I can understand because it is still awkward. right? Because you still have to almost brute force your way through some parts of the puzzles. And I think that is what I will really say is like when you have to brute force the puzzle when it's supposed to kind of like teach you the mechanic and then you like apply that mechanic. But if you have to brute force it, then yeah, it's not going to be fun.
Yeah. I mean, I do get it. Later on, I did, when I was a teenager, buy my Ocarina of Time and experiences myself.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the newer versions reworked the water temple a bit so that it's not that annoying, right? So maybe that's...
I
Yeah?
don't know about if they made the dungeon itself easier, but they did give a lot of ways of getting the more information about how to do things. They did help usability in the later versions. So
That's probably why I don't have that pure hatred that you're oozing out because I didn't experience the worst version.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, the
That
last
shadow mini boss was hard, but
Yeah,
unless you know the cheesing strategy, then he becomes a joke.
I mean that is pretty much sums up a Zelda game, and I will always argue that. As long as you know the cheese, it's just a joke. Oh.
I wouldn't say that. Like most bosses are built around a specific strategy, and you still need some skill to execute it, right? And that's the only way to beat them. But the Shadow Clone or Dark Link was meant to be more of a skill set of how good are you at sword fighting. But if you spam the fire spell, you depending on how much life the Dark Link has, which depends on your own heart count, you can just spam it. He cannot dodge it, and he eventually dies or is so weakened that the final, the end, the few less hits becomes rather easy, right?
Well, I was mostly because I mean, I've played a lot of Legend of Zelda. I'm even wearing one of my Legend of Zelda shirts right now. So, um, it is kind of a running, or I guess it's not really a gag. I think sometimes it's normal design, sometimes it's just weird interactions. But there's been a lot of times where like Ganon or whoever the big boss for the game is has a very easy way of being murdered with something that's not normal. Like the time where you can use the butterfly net. Uh, Not going to get into that because it's just a dungeon. Like, this is supposed to be talking about dungeons, and that's another topic about boss fights and jank. Um,
But I mean, boss fights to a certain degree are also part of many
oh,
dungeons,
yeah.
right?
Yeah. Oh, let me put it this way. I want to talk about boss fights specifically at a later time because I think there's a lot of things we can talk about boss fights in general. That being
Yeah,
said,
I'd say that's
go ahead.
I'd say that's fair, taking from what Blaze is saying of boss fights are very much part of the interaction of dungeons, right? And your dungeon should hopefully reflect that, because bad dungeon design is, oh no, we're walking through this place where it's filled with fire, it's got fire themes. All right, people, sorcerers, wizards, change your spells, make sure you're doing ice. So we can get to the item, and then you get to the very end of it, and it's like, it's really me, Galatius, the Ice King, and you're like, what? What's happening here? Like, literally, this whole dungeon told me something else is happening.
Right.
Or like we had a game where basically somebody ran a dungeon, they didn't phrase things correctly, which meant that we walked into a room, the bones are all mangled and torn apart on the floor. That tells all of us it's a monster. Of course, we get in there, and then the trap triggers, and we get smashed against the ceiling. And well, all of us were kind of like, okay, well, you don't use words like mangled and gnawed and shredded. You use words like crushed or blah blah, whatever.
Yeah.
Pulverized.
Yeah, there's a lot of successful words you can use to not do what you did.
Yeah.
But I think that's part of it, is the dungeon being a confined location that the players can't leave till they defeat it. I think a lot more thought has to go into them than I think what we see in more modern stuff where it's like it's not supposed to be a kidnapping scene, right? Like you can't
Right.
leave till you have the dungeon. The dungeon should fit in with your world. It should feel important to the world. What's happening, you know?
Yeah.
Um,
Obviously, it has to feel connected to whatever story you're doing as well. Like, because like if the players have no reason to be there besides just existing, then why just why, right? Goes
I mean,
back
and that's fine if you do the Borderlands thing of like, oh, what do you guys want to play in your TTRPG? All of us are vault hunters, and we love going into dungeons and stealing a bunch of stuff and then leaving a dungeon. And you're like,
but
boom, I
yeah,
have
but
the game for you.
yeah, but that's kind of the whole shebang of it is like you already know how that's connected to your players. I'm more implying like, you know, you're kind of sold of, well, you guys need to go and stop this big bad, and so you decided to go to Bibbidi Bobbidi and go into their basement and to check stuff out, and then you just kind of existed, I guess. Right? Like there, you should have some good connections to what is going on. At least I always feel. Like
Mhm.
because just awkward dungeon association when even when you don't need to use a proper old style dungeon or something. Um, it's just, I mean, it makes things awkward in the story and kind of can not help selling the dungeon. That being said, this is a great time to move on to the next point of discussion of different types of dungeons, where they have like different end goals and stuff. Because I do have a couple of lists of different types of dungeons I've kind of I recognize as things. Uh,
Mhm.
so I'll quickly go over that list and then see if you maybe we can discuss about each one in specific, or if you guys have other ones that you kind of want to pitch out there. So the first one would just be a very small mission-focused dungeon where like it has the 5-room dungeon, right? Like it's you have an entrance, exit point, and then a couple of puzzle challenges, right? Very simple, very quick, really good in tabletop spaces for just giving a player something to do for that session. And I mean, it could literally just be you tied it to the story because there is a quest to go and do blank and like take care of this big bad, or not big bad, but this, you know, annoyance to the city that lives in this cave. It could be someone was kidnapped and I mean, you're going to go save them, and that's the kind of like the whole theme of it. But a very small, very focused sort of dungeon. The next one is the like next higher up where it's like it could be like a couple of floors or something, but the whole like point is kind of the player progression on a very small scale of you're trying to get your players from like level X to level Y. It is literally for them to level up so that they could take on whatever the next big challenge is. It is there for gaining them experience. And I mean, we can see that obviously that's kind of what I point. A lot of video games, especially Legend of Zelda, that is the type of that sort of dungeon, right? Those dungeons are the ones where you're just going, you're learning a mechanic that and gaining a capability that will be useful later. Uh, Less about the dungeon in and of itself, but of course you still have that like feeling of awesome, well, succession when you do tackle that dungeon because you have quote unquote mastered that power, or at least gotten better with it. The third is the concept of the mega dungeon, which I did not realize that it was as foreign to the newer tabletops as it is tabletop players because of I did a community question about mega dungeons not that long ago, and there was a lot of people who said they never heard of the term. And then me, I've been like with the tabletop that I've been around, I know of mega dungeons because it was just a common concept where the entire game is tied to that dungeon, right? Like your entire character's progression is from level 1 to level 20 inside that dungeon. The entire experience is that dungeon, and it is literally just, can you beat this dungeon? And then the last one that I kind of wanted to point out as an exist is kind of a special thing that is honestly one of my favorites to design, is what I call Labyrinth, because they are randomly generated dungeons. Players are trapped, randomly generated, and the entire experience is to do whatever related to that dungeon, but like it is constantly changing and fluctuating around the players. Though in tabletop experience, it is one of the harder ones to pull off because you need a good tool set to be able to do that. So, yeah. That is like the list of the types of dungeons that I have. And I think that it encompasses most type of dungeons. So, I mean, I think we can all, like, if we think about like mission focused small dungeons, that's probably one of the easiest to kind of think of like tabletop experiences, especially with like the very small dungeon like quests you can buy on like itch.io or whatever. Like when someone makes a side story, normally it's tied to a small dungeon using the 5-room concept. But yeah. Now I feel like I overtalked. I'm sorry.
You're fine. I would only add the concept of the puzzle dungeon as compared to a dungeon with puzzles,
Right.
and the escape dungeon, like the movie The Cube. It is a dungeon, but they did not enter it. They wake up in it, and the whole point is to survive and escape.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like that all of a sudden adds a different total atmosphere and feeling, and technically a different design structure.
Yeah.
Like there is no boss necessarily. There is no traps necessarily. The whole thing is something meant to kill you. So I would say that, in my opinion, those two are two different types of dungeons. Those three don't easily fit.
I can see that. I do think that like that is a good point. I don't know if I would still call them differences, because I think like to me, like obviously the goal matters, right? Like number one of the goal of how that dungeon is tied to the story will always matter. And the way that I was separating them was more or not about the goals, but as much as about the how they're connected, like the how long the player is going to be in them, and like how much do they like how complicated I guess they are or something. But I mean that is a good clarification about there are some dungeons that are just puzzle dungeons where the whole concept is to solve the puzzle of the dungeon. I definitely agree with that, because I mean there are some great use cases for that sort of concept. And then escape ones where you want to escape, which is also a very interesting concept in a dungeon design, because you do have to think about it slightly different than just going deeper. You're trying to not go deeper. Going deeper is bad normally. um, but yeah, I totally agree with adding those separations.
Yeah, within reason or mixing, I think that pretty much covers any dungeon I could think of.
Yeah. Welcome back, Jeff. Or, well, your camera's not completely back, but like.
Hello. Let's see here. The cube. Cube is definitely one that came to mind as far as like, this is my favorite example of like a mega dungeon that makes sense for the meta of the world that has a cube in it.
Right.
That it doesn't have to make sense for anything else, right? Because there's no bathrooms anywhere, right? There's no bedpans. It's like, welcome to this giant matrix of death that we have made for who knows what reason. I mean, I guess there's 3 movies that they eventually will tell you. why the cube even exists. But the cube is kind of like Dark Souls, right? Like Dark Souls and whatever the new one is, Elden Ring. Like they're all mega dungeons, right? Like you were born into the mega dungeon, you'll die in the mega dungeon, and the only escape is effectively to stop playing.
Yeah.
Winning the game.
Yeah, and once you win the game, then you can leave the dungeon, and you're immediately allowed to escape, right?
I thought the only way of escaping these dungeons was death. No.
But
I mean, not
like,
in Dark Souls and Elden Ring.
Right. You can't die. Oh. Or,
and that's
you can, but...
Yeah.
Well, so I had a brief idea of like thinking about other movies and stuff. You know, like Home Alone is to some extent a dungeon, right?
Right.
We just have changed it. Instead of a Minotaur, it's Kevin McAllister,
which is honestly scarier, but
which, yeah, like if you have tiny Batman locked in a box and he's going to make a bunch of traps that you have to fight, that's the worst thing that could happen.
I'd use that in adventure. Batman in a box.
I mean, yeah, you could easily do that. You just have an adorable kobold or goblin that was, locked behind and nobody came back to get him. And they've had months to sit around and design traps for the small mansion they have in the Underdark. Go crazy with it.
That's great.
But yeah, I just like the cube. The cube was definitely one that came to mind as far as mega dungeons. But I think I was trying to think of a social dungeon.
Okay.
Because I was trying to think like, okay, well, how does that look? And I feel like there's got to be a movie for it. Maybe it's a movie I haven't seen or a genre I don't normally watch where somebody. Do you have something, Blaze? Do you have a social dungeon?
Yes, that reminds me of Mass Effect 3 in a Citadel DLC where they have to infiltrate a casino. That kind of that's the first thing I thought of when you said social dungeon.
So would that mean if you're counting that? Would that mean the dressing Cloud and Drag in Final Fantasy VII is also a dungeon?
I mean, I haven't played that game, but from what I've heard, I guess kind of. But I mean, that's more like collecting the outside the dungeon, collecting the pieces of the dress and all of that, and then going in. Right? It's not like maneuvering the social content in the dungeon. But
right.
I mean, I might be stretching, but that to me almost sounds like what a political campaign is.
Right.
Because you're stuck within the realms of the political topic situation. Your reputations are at stake, and you have to use social or similar skills to accomplish the goals, maneuver the challenges, and beat the boss or the polls.
Yeah, I feel like you could make a really interesting social dungeon, whether through a game that you're focusing on political aspirations, and it basically functions like the water dungeon. Now that I think about it, of like, all right, you got to talk to this person to get the idea of where you kind of stand, right? What your social influence is, so you can leave the party. Certain people you're going to want to talk to are these fundraising people, and that means you're going to have to adjust effectively like the level, the political level, the water level, in order to get access to certain people, so that way you can unlock the way to get out of the dungeon with the funding you need, or the fundraiser, the fun dungeon, the fungeon, as you would.
The fungeon.
See, I love and hate that you accidentally made a political joke there and no one caught it. We're talking about a water temple and politics, and the water temple has water gates. And just look up Watergate.
Don't look up what? No! Don't bring up Watergate in my fun time tabletop chats.
Oh, I'm dropping immediately. I was just like, oh god. Because like those aren't topics I enjoy. I haven't actually paid attention to news in like 3 years out of self-choice.
Right. But no.
I guess the thing is, I guess I kind of feel like if we're between social stuff, between cubes, between Pokemon, all that. I don't know if you guys at the very beginning tried to define a dungeon, but it feels like for the most part, any forced location and interaction for the players would count as a dungeon to some extent. Like,
Mhm.
I guess to a little bit, going to work is basically entering a dungeon for 8 hours.
That is what I imagine every time, because dealing with the dungeon boss, the only thing is you're not allowed to kill the. Oh,
I mean, but
That
if you want to leave the dungeon quickly and fast, you just stop playing the game, and they'll just let you leave.
That reminds me of a YouTube video that I watched, World of Warcraft, which is where
Oh my gosh.
Warcraft characters play a video game, and it's basically exactly that. They go to the video game is an office, and they have to handle all sorts of normal chores. And the boss of the dungeon is the boss, right?
Right, right.
And you had the guy who butters up the boss to keep him in a good mood. You have like the accountant guy who just did all the number stuff.
You know,
Yeah.
I actually, just to refine for like the viewers, Kyle, I have an interesting question for you, and feel free anyone else, because I don't actually have an opinion on this, and I'm gonna hate but enjoy your answer if you have the yes, I agree.
Oh, okay.
Just so you know, but I want your honest opinion.
Yeah.
With the way you've been categorizing um, dungeons, would you count a setting like Barovia at which you cannot escape easily? You have to solve puzzles. There is a boss. Would that count as a setting dungeon? Or would you just count that as a specific type of setting you can't escape?
Barovia is the setting of
Curse of Strahd,
Curse of Strahd.
the Shadow
That's what I
Spell
thought.
thing.
That is what I thought. But I was like, I don't want to seem like a fool and say that and then like get a bunch of people like attacking me. Don't feel like that today. Maybe tomorrow. But no, actually, thinking about that, okay, so I'm going to begin my statement by saying I don't know that much about the actual Curse of Strahd campaign. I've not played it.
If there's
I've
any
only
questions you need about the setting, I love that. It is the greatest thing, hands down, D&D has ever done, and D&D didn't do it. A fan did.
fair. Like I've heard great things, obviously. I have a lot of friends that are really into it. But I just like I've not yet read any of the story or like any of the book and anything like that. It's mostly been people telling me their experiences. So, from what I know, with that in mind, I would say I think I do actually consider it a mega dungeon in a very unique sense because it itself is kind of locking the players into an area, right? And the whole goal is to get from like the entire adventure is built in this location, which I believe is like a city nation concept of
Long
that
story
location,
short, small kingdom area,
right?
basically a few villages and a castle,
Right.
yanked out of the material plane, thrown in this place, caused the demi-plane they can't escape.
So the only times that I would not, so again, I guess let me ask a question, and this will help clarify my answer. When you go into these villages, are they essentially part of the dungeon experience? Or
Yeah,
are they stops of play?
they can add to the whole atmosphere by you realizing, like, for example, one place, the villagers are forced to do parades and these festivals
Okay.
to bring happiness, and everyone's
Yeah.
going nuts from it, and people are killed off from it. So every location you go shows you the dread, the hopelessness, and the horrors of Barovia.
Yeah, so because uh the villages kind of have their own like story or whatever and kind of tie into the experience, I would say in a very loose sense it is a mega dungeon in my sort of like way of thinking about them of You have a very specific location, right? Like that's been stated, like it's a narrative location. You just have a very big area that Playpen is. And everything is tied narratively to the same location, and it's about the players kind of growing and challenged constantly, tied to that experience. So yes, I would definitely say that that would be, in my sense, a mega dungeon.
Okay.
Is there any arguments to that?
My only
I
one
mean,
is that
if
I would
we,
term it a setting dungeon, but that's why I wanted your opinion.
Hmm.
as the thing is, I don't think there's like a clear cut definition of dungeon. It's more like almost a bit like a gut feeling. Yes, this is a dungeon. This is
Hmm.
not a dungeon. But if you use your definition, then yes, Barovia is definitely a dungeon.
Right. So I
One
think.
quick,
Go ahead.
not you
I think
or
for me, and then I'll pass it on. The big difference is that if there was times within that game where you have the lull points and whatnot, and it's about more about going to these problem areas and less about there are problems everywhere to be solved. That is the big difference between a mega dungeon versus a bunch of mission focused or floor dungeons, right? Because like that is kind of the whole point. It to me is like, do they tie all together to be a mega dungeon, or is it that you have like a base of operation that there's no problems in that location, like, and you can kind of go to different locations when they matter to you or not. Um, I think that kind of plays into where I start making the big difference for, is it a mega dungeon or is it just a bunch of them?
I want to ask you all a question.
Okay.
What is the favorite dungeon you ever created? Like, what's your favorite dungeon?
Ooh,
And what made it special in your eyes?
okay.
Man,
That actually goes great
mine.
with the next topic, anyways, of talking about dungeon design. So I'm very okay with that. Do you have a answer, Eternal? Why I think about it?
Oh yeah. No. Funny side note. This originally was meant to be a one shot, and just little thing. I suck at making one shots because I can't make them short.
Mm-mm.
That's my only issue. I had to figure out, oh, they need to go into this place and do this thing, then it's over. Oh, that's boring. So I had a problem with that. I accidentally made an 8 session long venture into a wizard's tower called Akaviri's Tower.
Mm-mm.
And like, man, I was thinking, okay, so this guy's trying and kidnapping people from this village. So we got to have the torture room and the storage room for stuff. There's going to be this teleporting room of the realm, so we can go like to the fire plane and get the shells of the salamander and different things. And so you would have to go through like the water area. And you would put on these magnetic boots and walk around the bottom of the thing, and there's the chest. There's small little things, but under there was also the object that he had to put in the little thing that would teleport to the wizard.
Mm.
So you had the assistant and the wizard there, and this was literally their home, their workspace, and it's actually not even in the plane. They had to transfer through a portal they had to find near a false tower. So this became this small little one shot and just kept evolving and evolving, and it almost became its own realm of dread in the Shadowfell. Like, that's why it was my favorite, because it didn't just stop upon creation. Everything the players wanted to do or asked helped evolve it. The more I created, the more came alive for it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's my super wizard tower, basically.
Nice. That is really interesting. Super Wizard Tower. And I love the evolution of, like, it was supposed to be a one shot, but accidentally that's not how it ended up. And I think that's true for a lot of times when we start with an idea going, it's probably going to be a one shot, or maybe this will be a medium campaign, and then yeah, no, that I wrote too many notes, and there's just too much things that the players could do, and the players obviously are probably going to do, because I know my players, and they are definitely going to do as much as they can.
Yeah, it went from save Billy in the well to freaking like dragon heist,
Right.
like real quick. Like it. I'm going to eventually put that one out there. I still got all the maps and everything for it, but
Nice.
I am no artist.
Yeah.
I can't do any of that. But that's one that I'm going to change around to do the play test of the core system real quick because it's designed for non-magic characters.
Okay.
You can play it with magic characters, but then it's not as surprising what that magic device will do.
Yeah. That's I mean that's really rad. I mean, having an idea of a mission that you like to run is always really good, and also kind of sucks when you don't find something that you constantly always want to run for playtesting, because like, especially because for playtesting's sake, just having a constant story is always really good for making sure everything is balanced. That being said, going back into the original question, I do have an answer. So I don't only do tabletop design stuff. I do like to think about video game design, and specifically have worked on a couple of video game ideas. It's just, not having an artist myself and stuff, like video games is a little bit more complicated of trying to do, because you end up like having to fake a lot of assets or buy the asset bundles, but then like your game doesn't look that unique. But that's a whole nother discussion. Um, One of my favorite dungeons that I've designed and planned on running, uh, though I only got a actually I designed it for a video game concept that I wanted to make, and I still kind of want to make it in the sort of 2D Legend of Zelda-esque exploration. And the whole concept of the dungeon is, well, I'm going to say the main enemy, but not enemy. The main concept problem within it is that this dungeon is actually a location that creates combustible slimes made out of oils that explode when you set them on fire. Now, the whole gimmick of it is like as a introductory place of getting bombs and blowing up walls, and have that sort of exploration of actually finding good areas to blow up, and using those slimes in that sort of manner. But I did try to run that game in a tabletop sense. Of course, it was with a very few amount of players, because it was just one of those situations where I didn't have that many players on hand to run it, and we all wanted to play something. And it went all right, but I think I liked the idea more than I like I think the problem with that game was more the players wanting to just chill. um, but I mean, it was still being worked on. But I just love the concept that I had, the themes of the powered generator that is these gasoline slimes, and doing and having the explosions and the bombs and the mechanics and all that sort of exploration you can do with it. But yeah, that would probably be my favorite one that I made. And I mean, I've made a couple of these concept of things, right? I mean, but yeah.
You, Jeff, do you have a favorite dungeon you designed?
I'm trying to think of one. And honestly, I mean, I'm not a big dungeon design person, right? Like, I don't.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not as big a fan of dungeons. But I guess when I think about when we're talking about what defines a dungeon and what systems have in that, it's like, oh, well, I guess we all have to use dungeons, right? Like, you eventually make them by the simple fact of making a place that players have to go, they have to interact, they have to find a thing, and once they're done, you let them run away as fast as possible. So just trying to think in my head of, have I designed any that I thought were specifically very cool? And I think no, there's none that stand out to me as being specifically cooler than other ones, right? I don't feel like I've designed any that are better. Like, I mean, I've definitely taken it since my games go more modern. I definitely have a lot of fun taking this into the realm of this dungeon is is like floors on a corporate level, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
you're having to get past things in a office setting. But yeah,
Yeah.
I guess I've never really pondered. I personally don't like a lot of standardized dungeons, so I don't use them as much.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like none of mine really stand out. Like at the end, they're all like, "Oh, okay, cool, that was fun," but I'd rather put effort into other parts of the game.
Yeah, I totally get that. I myself am also not that big of a fan of creating, especially mega dungeons. Maybe more like small dungeons, like
Mm-hmm.
places. Especially, like I like designing my campaign one piece at a time, right? And a mega dungeon forces you to implement the whole thing at once, even if you don't fill every room at the beginning. But
Mm-hmm.
things like that substructure. But I do have a smaller dungeon that I kind of like. It was more of a puzzle dungeon, even though there was a combat at the end. And it was also narratively important since it was the beginning where the players started to find out about the the main plot of the campaign. And basically there were three elves the player was three elves working for the Death Guard, they are called, right? From Eberron, the Elven Order.
Mm-hmm.
And they were sent to a place in the middle of the jungle, mostly because, hey, our experts have like deciphered a bit of the draconic sorry, my friend. Not proficient. Prophecy. There we go. I'm sorry. Of the draconic prophecy, and it says for some reason you have to go there. We don't know why. And there they found a temple, which was a very old temple, which was specifically built to confer like the destiny of three groups of people, them being one of them, and the temple had different challenges, one for each of the draconic gods of Eberron. So you had those thematic puzzles, but also a very important thing. One of the groups, which were also tied to there and had to be able to get through there, were three relatively incompetent goblins. The Goblins Crusade. They were part of the Silver Flame. They had a lot of heart, but not that much brain.
Solid.
So, basically, I also built puzzles in a way that a goblin just going with the gut feeling would also solve it. Which, like the first one was for the good drag god, Siberis, which was a test of faith. There was an invisible, like, the classic invisible bridge with fire, and there was a text about, I don't know exactly what it was, but something about you have to walk in faith or something like that. Of course, the dumb goblins, which were also a cleric, a paladin, and a bard, would just jump right in. The players were a lot more hesitant, but they figured it out. Then the next one was about Eberron, the neutral dragon, and for him it was very important for the mortals to decide their own fate. That's why also they created that world, the three dragons, right? So you had a sword which represented power, and three statues which were holding out for a sword. You had a goblin, and an angel, and a devil, right? And basically the power should be given to the mortal, the goblin, Of course, the goblins would just say, "Goblet, let's give it to the goblin." They had to think a lot time about it, but they also saw that the last one.
Yeah.
I stole that one. The last puzzle was for Cower, the evil dragon, and I stole that from Assassin's Creed Black Flag.
Solid.
I mean, it's not a bad idea to steal puzzles from some other places, right? It's most likely your players never heard about it, and yeah, the puzzle was basic.
I mean,
Yeah,
steal like an artist,
yes,
right?
exactly.
Take inspiration from and make it your own. That's the key, right? That is
Yeah,
one of my favorite
Mhm.
actual books that I got from my wife a while ago. Is literally that is the mantra of it: is steal like an artist.
Yeah, the last puzzle there were three animal statues. One of them was a predator, the others weren't, and they had to find out which statue is different.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't quite catch that one, and the dungeon summons a demon at each stage if you fail the test. So they had to fight a demon,
Mm-hmm.
and then yeah, I mean I think I'm going. And the
That's
final
fine.
level was an orb that only those fated to touch it could touch it. Otherwise, it would summon a giant demon. And if you touch the orb, you see the prophecy about the three groups, each representing one of the divine dragons, and that they were destined for conflict. The goblins being one of them. Well, but yeah, somebody sent by in there was trapped because the door closes behind you in the at each level, and the only way to open them up is by touching the orb and being the right person to touch it.
Right.
So it was also funny to see like a reoccurring bad guy there trapped
Yeah.
and frustrated. Yeah, which I really also like that reoccurring bad guy. He was more of like a lower level lieutenant
Mm-hmm.
called Lazarus because he was an undead who with a specific curse that he always came back. Like he could not really die, so they kept killing him, and he always kept showing up.
That's
Until, of
great.
course, they brought them to their high priest, and she incinerated him to the last atom. And yeah, with a holy spell, that would do it.
Rude. No.
I loved that campaign. That was like the greatest campaign I ever did.
It sounds amazing. Really great. I mean, like I said, it did sound really cool.
Mhm.
But yeah. Eternal, did you want to say something? It seemed like you did in the middle of that.
I have no idea what it was now.
Oh, okay, that's fine.
I'm sorry.
I mean, it's,
Don't be.
yeah. I'll take the blame. It's my fault. So there is another dungeon or another thing that I've built. Actually, a couple of things that I built. One of my favorite dungeon types to design is Labyrinth, because I love to make dungeons that make themselves. Of course, they're kind of difficult to do to properly design so that it's not boring for the players who play them more than once, but it's just a very interesting, fun design space. For me, anyways. Of course, you have to come up with like, why is it a labyrinth? Like, how does this labyrinth concept works? Like, why does it change, right? And not every tabletop system can properly run them, but I mean, you can try with a lot of them. But I do love that concept of, well, let's find out what happens in the next room, and then, oh, look at this room is blank, 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 and well, yeah. I've even running them is just always so fun because I don't even know what will essentially happen next. But I don't have too many of them released to really talk about. I do have one released right now. Um, but like I've made a lot of them that are in my like Google Drive that I share with people. I just haven't really pushed many of them to any actual release to show. But I do like to use them. I use cards for the generation, playing cards, because it gives a good little visual cue for some of the separation for options. But like I said, I think that it's just really interesting to design them, and they're really fun to design and run for myself. But I mean, yeah. When it comes down to things, I will say if you listen to Jeff's podcast, I will say my favorite dungeon of his to listen to would probably be the Mountain Woods area, because that was just really intense and interesting. But I don't want to say too much for those who haven't actually listened, but yeah, that was fun. That would probably be my favorite of yours that I've heard. um, but that is also in a different sort of sense, because experiencing the dungeon as a story and not as a player. I don't know if it was necessarily fun to play. I assume it was, but that is a different way of taking in the dungeon, right?
Yeah, there's kind of an odd level of whether you're. I think somebody brought this up earlier, like the Mad Mage stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, where that dungeon's not made for the characters, it's made to mess with the players, right? It's our Psycho Mantis from Metal Gear that tells you about your saved games,
right?
And so I think that is kind of a different level to it, right? Is your dungeon for the characters to experience? Then cool, you'll probably have a pretty good dungeon because you're taking account what the characters can do, and then that applies to actions that can be taken in the dungeon, right? If you're making your dungeon more meta, like the Mad Mage kind of thing, where it's supposed to confound the players, right? Like the players know they're going to the Mountain of the Mad Mage, so they're going to design their favorite Goblin Rogue Paladin multi-class that takes advantage of the following 3 feats to create this power game combo that'll let them get through a dimension door trap or whatever. But they're going in with that idea. Like there's that. But I guess there's that third level that kind of interesting. It's like, what if you're not the player or the GM? What if you're listening to a dungeon? Which is, I guess, that's our movie. Our movie enjoyer watches the person goes through the dungeon, and this is where it changes to something from like Cube, which I think the first one was fun, right? Oh wow, crazy! Every room has a different murder death trap for some stupid reason. Versus, I'd say the bad version of that is when you get into the Saw movies, right? The first Saw movie or second one, fine. I mean, they're gory, but they had a theme, a premise. This is a dungeon. You wake up in it. There's usually 3 to 4 Rube Goldberg divisive monstrosities that are going to happen depending on what happens in the dungeon. But you get to ones like, I think like the 5th one where they just have Marky Mark's brother's head get smashed in by giant ice cubes, and you're like, I don't know what's happening anymore. But it's interesting to see. It's interesting to think about how does your dungeon feel at all of those levels, like ones that you guys have made. If somebody were to watch you run it, would they enjoy it, or would they go, okay, this feels a little tough on the players, or maybe this is boring from a mental aspect? And all of us have made boring ones, right? Like, everyone's definitely had a phone in a dungeon before where you're like, shit, I'm not ready for the session. Looks like these bastards need a dungeon. What's my dungeon? Where are we? Cemetery, woods? I'm making. Oh, looks like there's 6 rooms. Maybe they'll find a bedpan behind this tree, and you kind of go from there, right?
Right.
But it is. But yeah, that is a fun third level I hadn't really considered of. In the movie sense, the thing you create, is that fun to watch or hear, right? Like, or is it fun because you're playing in it?
Yeah.
See, in a way, in movies, you have that show don't tell concept. In tabletop, you really don't have those same tools as much as you walk in and you start to see your breath in the air, so you don't have to tell them it's cold. You got stuff like that, but that's where the hey, design a bedroom, design their storage area, leave some tools out, show stuff mid-process. That describing those things is the showing them without you saying you walk into the guy's laboratory or torture room. You can
That
just literally describe some
yeah.
elements. That's what's going to attach the watcher or the listener.
Yeah.
Where the player they're looking for, like, we know where we are, what's going to happen.
Yeah.
From the game master, it's got to be fun. It can't just feel like you're waiting for this point in time. Okay, activate this, then activate that. There's got to be some fun and variety to changing it up. That also benefits the players for replayability.
Yeah.
But that's kind of what you bringing up those different levels of it made me think of, like, in reference to my dungeon design. What am I thinking about? It lined up with those 3 points.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I definitely agree. Like you have to kind of consider your audiences. I pluralize that because obviously there's multiple different types of audience. Players, like yourself, anyone who's listening. That is actually something that I learned myself back in college because when we did our bigger games, bigger number of players, there was a lot of people who just kind of wanted to listen in and not actually play. Of course, this was still in physical meet space. Um, so like we would have like a big table with a bunch of people playing, but also a bunch of people listening and like trying to not only making it fun for those who are sitting and playing, but also for those who's listening in is something you have to kind of like be aware of. How do you make that entertaining? If you're trying to, of course, entertain them or not. It is an interesting experience for sure. So we don't have too much time left. I mean, we got like 15 minutes, so we can kind of touch on the next key bits. So I guess I'm gonna like, when you design a dungeon, or when you even start thinking about the dungeon concept and how you want to build those, what are the things that you, as that sort of dungeon designer, are thinking about? What do you like to focus in on, and what you think needs to be focused in on when you're building them? And do you have design tips that you feel like you can share?
I'm a huge nerd for systems, right? Like I really enjoy um like ecosystems, and I really want to see when I either play in a dungeon or when I design one, I usually say, okay, like what's the magic hat they're stealing? All right, I've got a magic hat. I put it in the middle of this dungeon. Who defends the magic hat? It's the guy who really loves magic hats, and he's the bad guy that they have to defeat. But then when I look at the rest of the dungeon, it's like, cool, how to make this dungeon make sense?
Right.
How do I make it like, cool, who builds a freaking magic hat? Who would defend a magic hat? What monsters would move in here? Now, are these monsters in the local area, right? Because if this is supposed to be part of a larger world, you can't just have like, surprise, in here, flaming skeletons walk around freely, opening doors with their Knoll barbarian best friends. It's like, oh, well, that's weird, because if I go outside, there's like a CR2 wolf by itself and a pup. No burning skeletons have wandered out of this dungeon, kind of thing.
Right.
And so that's the stuff that I always like to see. The more a dungeon feels complete in a world sense, feels part of the world, right?
Yeah.
The more interesting I think it is, and the more fun, even if I'm not playing, if I'm not the active player, right? The rogues searching for traps or the clerics doing whatever. It's still interesting as long as that all fits together. Which I don't know if Marshall the historian is in chat or anything. Hopefully not, because I'm about to make fun of him just a little bit.
Oh, sweet.
He did a fun little dungeon. You're going through the basement, you're going through the house. But he had a panic moment because obviously he wanted to put a Hydra in his dungeon. But he didn't think about it. as much as he could have. So the panic moment was we get to the attic, and there's a Hydra, and all of us kind of stopped and went like, why the hell is there a Hydra in the attic? Like, that's crazy because we're in a house. So do they have like a play school ramp? Did they push the Hydra up here? Like, how does this get here? Which of course put him into a panic spiral as a GM, a young GM at the time, of like, yeah, there's a ramp. You guys just missed it. It's like, so like we could just push the Hydra out of the house then. Like, they have to slide it up here and then they go upstairs to feed it. And they're like, what was the plan here? And the dungeon fell apart pretty quick as soon as we started. You know, it's definitely that you push the wall and you're like, wait a second, this isn't a Western town. This is a movie set.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was a very funny moment. We can all look back and laugh now. Sorry, Marshall. But it's part of that thing of, you know, spend the extra time to make sure your dungeon fits the world, and I think it'll all around be cooler for everyone involved. This, and even the GM, because if you do it to some extent right, you can make even boring dungeons foreshadow plot points that you want to have. This is a great place to sneak in other adventurers in your world that died. Maybe they, you know, you find the bicycle helmet of, you know, Kevin the Righteous, who's down here because he got murdered by burning skeletons that are no best friends. So I don't know. I guess to finalize that your question, I love seeing dungeons that fit the world and tie the world together by becoming, as opposed to a standalone spot, right? Like, oh, you go through the story, you're in Barovia. I want to see them integrated.
Right. Okay. Any other statements? Anyone want to jump in?
I guess I don't like to waste the player's time, right? If you hear dungeon, you it's you get the again today my English, my brain, temptation. There we go. Just temptation to just fill one room after the other with a combat encounter, and this is the zombie room. This is the golem room, and so on. I do try to avoid it. I think that's also why I prefer smaller dungeons, you know, which get to the point. Of course, do have the disadvantage that they are less fight of attrition, right? Where you pick away at your characters bit by bit, which can also be build up quite the tension. But yeah, I guess I'm not much of a giant dungeon guy, especially because they take a lot more energy to design.
I mean, they can, yeah. Okay.
Or you just do dungeon generator, and then you just roll random creatures and fill them in, and huge dungeon is done.
Don't have to pitch that hard. No, but yeah, no. I mean, there are tools out there to, of course, throw in. Like they can take a lot of energy, especially when you don't do them that often. It's just really awkward. Like it is a skill, and the more you do the skill, the easier it gets. The more you can like learn the quick parts. And I mean, there are design things as stated that are like there is the well-known thing of the I think it's called the 5-room dungeon. Is what I said earlier. Where there is a guide of what you put in these rooms to make a very rough and dirty dungeon that is just for that like one game or whatever, like just a really quick dungeon. Right, and like that is kind of the flow of them. And I mean, obviously there is like you can obviously stray away from them, but it's just it is a skill to learn. And like the better you get at it, of course, the easier it will get. But
one final thing I can say, because it didn't come up during the complaints about the bad dungeon design. Never make a dungeon for the sole purpose of being a MacGuffin holder.
Right.
It's really, really hard to do that. And the only successful example I've seen is Elder Scrolls, where you have literally like this whole dwarven facility surrounding this one thing to get an Elder Scroll. Like that was
Right.
really cool. It brought lore, brought history, brought extra levels of lore for the world and surrounding stuff.
Right.
It wasn't just a holder for it.
Hmm.
Diablo sucks at that. And
Right.
I love Diablo games.
Right. Like, and I think that ties back into what Jeff was saying of tying the dungeon into the world, not just what is its point in the story, but also like because you have a good excuse with these dungeons to connect them, and I think that's a great point, and you should connect them. For myself, the final pit I think that I want to like thing of tying is, I mean, dungeons don't have to be something like obviously you should think about how they tie in, as we've said. You know, don't make them like just for this one thing and then don't explain on them. Like make them unique, make them interesting, but don't trick yourself into thinking that they are super complicated, like it's a bad tool or an awkward tool to use, as much as it's just a tool. Like I was saying, it is something that you get better with the more you do. And there are wonderful design concepts that I could spend hours talking about good dungeon design tips. Like, don't have more than like roughly 7 enemy types because I mean, if you have too many enemy types in the dungeon, even if it's a mega dungeon, then like you start to like the players the story of that dungeon starts to get weaker the more variety of those enemies, right? Now that doesn't mean you can't have different enemies, but like make them don't have too many different types. I don't know how to explain that better. Um,
No, no, I think you're onto something with that because the idea there is the dungeon should have a theme. It shouldn't feel like an escaped zoo,
right.
right? If
And
every floor is a random new monster, it doesn't feel like the GM uh, built this unless they clearly give hints that like this mad mage has collected monsters from every plane and they've locked it here, but now that he's died, they're all free and they all wander the blah blah blah.
yeah.
Sure, go for it, but don't make that the usual. But the idea there is there needs to be a theme to hold this all together, right?
Mhm.
Like you.
Yeah.
I was going to say for a final thing as well, to go back to your very first question, my favorite dungeon I ever designed was a multi-tiered dungeon inside of a god that the players had to go through 5 rooms, effectively tied to various planes, in order to get to the center of the deity to remove the concept of material objects in the universe from the creature itself.
That's pretty cool.
Cool.
That's
And that's
fucking
the
rad.
end.
Whoa. Okay, I guess we'll end with that. Okay.
Mic drop.
Okay.
I'm not much of a dungeon maker. I just
Yeah.
have this like awesome
It's
cat
like I'm not
god
a dungeon
idea.
maker. I just put shit in gods and different realms and stuff.
Yeah, like okay, way to elevate,
Good
I
job, homie.
guess. Okay. Yeah, we're gonna go ahead and end the stream here. We're getting
Mhm.
close to the time that we normally end, and I mean, while we can go on, it's a really great place to end. So, with that
Yes.
being said, how about we go
You've
around?
escaped the conversation dungeon.
Yeah, right. Yeah. People want to say their goodbyes.
Bye,
Catch you
everybody.
later.
Okay.
Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.